everybody. Hopefully you have had a fantastic time at the first two workshops of the conference. It's now time to move on to our panel discussion. And as climate change increasingly impacts on our heritage, volunteers and volunteering can play an important role in driving environmental action. And this discussion that we're going to have today will explore how volunteer programmes can help tackle climate change. So our panel of experts are going to bring their knowledge and insights to bear on conversations around reducing carbon footprint, showcasing successful volunteer-driven projects, and discuss engaging younger volunteers who are passionate about climate action. So I'm now going to pass you over to Rhiannon, our events executive and tech whiz, who is going to chair today's discussion. So over to you, Rhiannon.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Matt. And a huge thank you to our panelists that you can see on screen in front of you. I'm particularly thrilled to be talking about this topic today, as anyone who knows me knows I work for the Zoological Society of London. So this is very much our bread and butter to have these kinds of conversations. So just to recap, we're talking about empowering change, engaging volunteers in heritage and climate action. So our four panelists, brief introductions. We have with us Ben Marsh from Barnsley Council, Helen Wallis from Natural History Museum, Kirsty Haslam from Historic Environment Scotland, and Marie Weigand, apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly, you can correct me in a moment, from the Royal Horticultural Society. Thank you all so very much for being with us. And thank you also to all of you that have pre-submitted questions. We've got some great ones here, so we're going to crack on and head off with this now. So for our first question, by way of an introduction, I'd like to hear from all of our panelists, so we'll go to each in turn, to ask them why you think that heritage organisations have a part to play in driving environmental action and what this might look like. So we're going to go to Marie first.
Thanks, Rhiannon, and thanks for having me here today. I come from an organisation that has environment at its heart, with the Royal Horticultural Society, so everything gardening, plants. We have a sustainability strategy with a key aim at the moment to be net positive for nature, including biodiversity and biosecurity positive by next year, water neutral and climate positive by 2030. So it's very important to us, obviously. But I think as a volunteering professional, the part we play is demonstrating and influencing leadership and stakeholders how volunteering can be part of the solution. And this has been something we've been working on over the last year or so. Being from an organisation that's been around for over 200 years as well, in terms of heritage, there is a voice and a platform that has value, and recognising that to engage people to volunteer to help deliver these science solutions is vital. So getting leadership on board and them themselves recognising that is very powerful.
Lovely, thank you, Marie. And I deliberately went for quite a broad question so you could learn a little bit more about our panelists. So over to you, Helen.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so basically I work in the Natural History Museum, and we have obviously got specimens, plants and animals dating back, to Victorian times, and that's a really important resource for modern researchers. So we try to train up biological recorders. So most data on UK wildlife is actually collected by volunteers, and so we're just really trying to train up people, support the recorders who are there, and then link up all of their data. What sometimes happens is that volunteers have a huge amount of expertise in a particular subject. So, for example, butterflies, sometimes they're quite elderly, and then, they can sometimes pass away with decades of really, really important research. So one of the things that we're doing through our Urban Nature project is we're trying to set up something called a data ecosystem. So basically, I work in the gardens at the Natural History Museum. Some of you may know they've been recently completely refurbished. So we've now got 2 gardens. One of them is an evolution garden with information about, how plants evolve, mass extinction events, climate change. And then the other garden it's called the Nature Discovery Garden, and the focus is on UK wildlife. So as part of those gardens, we're recording new biological data. So we've got eDNA, where we take DNA samples from the pond, soil and air. We also record wildlife from inside the pond, birds and bats flying over. So we've got all of this new data with, kind of technological advances that we've got now. Brilliant. And then we've got tons of existing data within the museum and within volunteers' own supplies, as it were. Sorry.
Amazing. I'm going to stop you there, Helen, because we're going to drill down into some of this in the next question. So hold that thought, and we'll come back to a little bit about those gardens shortly. So just bring us back to that sort of opening question, a little bit about kind of why you feel that heritage organisations have a part to play in this field. And I'm going to go to Kirsty for your thoughts.
So thank you again very much for having us. So I'm Kirsty and I'm from Historic Environment Scotland, and I think there are a number of reasons why we can, why heritage organisations are well placed. Part of it, Marie touched on, we're often organisations that have stewardship baked into our kind of organisational remits, that we are organisations that are there both to look after something or some aspect of the historic environment or the environment in general, both for the present but also for the future, and that's baked into our kind of organizational remit. So I think it's great that kind of underpins a lot of our organizations. I think absolutely, as Helen's mentioned, we've got the opportunity to really have case studies or particular programs that really engage in very specific ways. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to kind of mention is the potential for partnerships, and for those to bring in, potentially audiences that might not engage in traditional volunteering programs, but for example, we would have employee-supported volunteering programs where groups from work environments might come in for a day to engage with our rangers teams at Holyrood Park, for example, and they'll help to do a wildlife survey, for example, and they're going to contribute in a way through a partnership partnerships with researchers, for example, that really sort of allows us to engage in that way as well. So I think that's an additional way that we're well placed.
Amazing. Some really interesting nuggets, and we're going to drill down into some of these amazing case studies that you've both started to talk about in due course. Any final thoughts on the sort of that wider picture from you, Ben?
Hi, I'm Ben. I work for Barnsley Museums on behalf of Barnsley Council. I suppose I've loved everything that everyone says. It's a really interesting topic. But I guess for me, one of the things I come back to is that museums, galleries, heritage assets of all shapes and sizes are very much seen as trusted spaces by both our volunteers and the general public. So that presents us with a real opportunity to share the messages and the learning we want to put across about this in lots of different ways, incredibly creative ways, through our exhibitions programs, through our volunteering, through the green spaces we look after, etc. So I just think museums and heritage at large has a real opportunity to engage people in this topic, but perhaps also in a way that doesn't feel too overwhelming, because we are spaces that they already consider safe. So that's my main thought.
Yeah, and that's a lovely thought, and I think there's loads to unpack even in that first question. And I think there is a lot out there around climate change, environmental action. It's very hotly debated. We have COPs, and there's a huge amount of information that comes out of those. but it can be, as you say, quite overwhelming for people to know really where to start, where to focus their energies, both as organisations and individuals. So my next question, I'm going to go to Kirsty first on this. What steps have you and any organisations that you've been involved with taken to ensure that your staff and volunteers are clued up on this topic and positively on board with the positive mission that your organisations are taking? So Kirsty, over to you. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. In Scotland, we have a national strategy called Our Past, Our Future, or OPAF, and the first priority within that is delivering the transition to net zero. So that ideally sort of cascades down through all of the activity that goes on within the historic environment. So within our organisation, you know, we have climate action plans, which have themes that we utilise when we're considering our volunteer development programmes. So thinking about sustainable travel, procurement, biodiversity, all these sort of topics. And for, you know, in terms of a kind of sharing all information, we have a climate change team, we have networks of green champions across the country. I think in anticipation of kind of today, I think I was reflecting that in terms of sharing this information with our volunteers, I'm aware, for example, that if we think about our basic induction template for our regular volunteering programme, if we have volunteers who engage specifically with this, with kind of climate related activity, so conservation volunteers, for example, there will be elements, there are additional kind of information within their induction that kind of builds on those topics and organisational and sort of information that we have. I am aware it's not always something that is part of the detail, you know, of all the induction for all of our volunteers, because not all of our volunteers sort of support a climate specific remit, but it has sort of made me reflect about whether there is something that we can do, and whether it's not necessarily part of in the detail is not necessarily part of a volunteer's induction, but actually is there more that we could be doing in terms of other routes to highlight the ongoing work within the organisation to ensure that all of the volunteers have access to that information. Is that through newsletters? Is that through talks from colleagues within our climate change team, for example? So I think this has actually been quite an interesting reflective exercise for me as well. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, to be honest, as I posed the question, I'm also reflecting on it from my side, in that actually there's a part of the responsibility is to take people on this journey with us, to see what action we can collectively and individually take. Marie, have you got anything to add? Great answer, by the way, Kirsty. You're on mute, my love.
There we go. Yeah, I agree with everything Kirsty has said. We have about 1,400, or maybe it's 1,400 volunteers at the RHS in our gardens, libraries and shows. And so it's a huge stream of people, but also a valuable avenue for the work of the RHS. And so this last year, we've been inviting our on-site volunteers onto talks regarding changes in gardening practices and the science behind them. So biosecurity of plants at gardens and shows, which is important for keeping plants free of pests and diseases that are being driven by climate change. And understanding the basic practices is fundamental, especially when talking to the public. We've also invited them onto seminars explaining the importance of being peat-free in our soil practices this last year, and there's such a value on the advocacy that they give in the wider community. Talking to visitors, talking to family, talking to everyone they're meeting outside of volunteering, and for them to understand why things may have changed throughout their own gardening journey. You know, this is the ripple effect into the wider audience by engaging the current volunteering population into the change of direction. And it's such a, you know, such strategic importance to us, and should be recognised.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our volunteers are a microcosm of society, aren't they? So absolutely, if we're engaging them well, then that's a huge part on the road. So we did have a question, and it's a sort of slightly more negative side of that sort of awareness piece around whether any of you have come across any climate change deniers, and if so, how you have engaged them, or how you perhaps have brought them on side. Has anyone got any experience of working with anyone who's quite negative about this area of work?
We haven't had climate change deniers so much. I think the volunteers that we have, you know, they can physically see the effect of climate change in the gardens and plants where they're working, you know, on every day. But, you know, we have had similar things in terms of diversity and inclusion, which again is, you know, people that sort of deny that. And so the experience is the same. You take them on the journey, you have to explain the, you know, the facts behind it and actually the outlook of the organization, and whether they choose to agree or not, but they're here, and to remember that volunteering is voluntary. You know, it's about being communicative with them and understanding where that's being driven from their own point of view, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add from anyone else on that? There's a really great point in there from Caroline in the chat around supporting colleagues to trainers, carbon literacy trainers. So thank you for that, Caroline. Lovely. So moving on, hopefully what we can all see is it's pretty obvious that we need to come together to tackle some of these issues. They are worldwide, huge issues for us as people and animals on this planet. The questions come in from one of our audience members reflecting on the situation in Valencia recently, which saw hundreds of volunteers take to the streets responding to the consequences of climate change, only to be told days later that the professionals would sort of manage this. The question is, how can we create an understanding that only together can we make the most impact? And how have you done this within your organisations, or what ideas might you have? We'll go to Ben first, see what thoughts you have on.
Yes, it's a huge question, really, isn't it, in so many ways. But I suppose thinking about it from an organisational level, that first step is really about getting everyone round a table, and that's what we did in Barnsley Museums. So we were responding to this in a number of different ways, but we were aware we needed to respond to it. So we kind of sat down and talked about what were we already doing, because we were, you know, people can sometimes feel that they're doing nothing around this topic, but much like diversity and inclusion, you possibly are doing things. You just need to understand that a little bit better. So we had that conversation. We talked about what was our wish list. You know, there are, you know, sadly, heritage assets are not necessarily cheap things to change, and they can feel then in your organisation, oh, what's the point? Because we can't actually achieve that in the immediate. But there are a number of things you can plan for the future, hopefully, and look at your funding. So for me, it was really about how do we get around the table? How do we, much like, again, learnings from diversity and inclusion, we then created an action plan that our entire organisation as Barnsley Museums looks at and uses, and much like we would with any other action plan, that also informs our business plans and our future progressing, to bring people with us in that learning and that conversation. And I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but I think that's the place to start, is just saying we need to sit down and talk about this. And it doesn't have to be in a confrontational way, and it doesn't have to be in a way that may switch people off, but it does have to kind of be in a way that is serious about the topic and has a planned set of actions at the end of it. And those actions might feel quite small, but again, much like access and diversity, which is another area I work with, those small steps lead to big ones. And so I think, we just that for me would be where we start bringing people together. It's just being very open about this topic and about our concerns about it, and about what the potential impact might be upon our various organisations.
Lovely, thank you, Ben. And various nods from the other panelists. I think a lot of that echoes with some of what they've spoken about around kind of organisational strategies and strategy for Scotland, etc. We're going to move on, and I'm going to come to Helen for this next question, because actually you started to talk a little bit about this in your introduction. We know it happens everywhere within volunteering, that it can often be the case that some of our volunteers have more knowledge and passion for action in particular areas of our work than our organisations, or perhaps we as volunteer managers do. have you experienced this within this field? And how can volunteer managers who they themselves may have limited knowledge of the topic and or limited power, I guess, within the organisation, best harness this energy? Any thoughts on this, Helen, following the intro?
Yeah, I would say as a volunteer manager, you're always looking to see how you can develop your volunteers as individuals as well as, like, you know, as a workforce, as it were. And so I just really signpost people to where they want to go, whether it is in terms of, you know, climate change. So, for example, at the Natural History Museum, we're shortly going to have a new exhibition, and it's an ongoing project called Fixing Our Broken Planet. So if I had anybody who was like really strongly wanting to be very politicized and really get involved, I would really point them towards that. I've got, you know, I mentioned earlier, I think a lot more about the biodiversity crisis, which really, I guess I'm more involved in biodiversity rather than climate change, but clearly the two underpin each other because, you know, ecosystem services offered by the natural world are absorbing carbon, and, you know, we really depend on nature, and once we lose ecosystems, you know, we can't, you know, it's very difficult to go forward from that. But, you know, I have got, you know, some volunteers who they just want to measure the pond every day, collect loads and loads of data. So I've just put them in contact with somebody who can use that data. So it's really just having partnerships both within the museum and externally as well, and, you know, just joining everyone up as best you can.
Sound like a brilliant listener, Helen. That's something we all need to remember, don't we, when working with our teams. Any thoughts from the rest of the panelists? Marie, maybe any further thoughts from you on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Helen has said, and it's about finding that relationship between the skill set that's being offered and where the organisational need is and where you can best place that. I mean, having volunteers that are very passionate and motivated about something it's part and parcel with volunteering. You know, they're freely giving their time to you, and they choose your organisation to do so. So they are invested in the outcome, and that can probably come out a little bit more overtly sometimes. But talking to anyone that comes forward and trying to understand where that motivation and passion is being driven from is key. And then, like I say, we may not have the knowledge that they're talking about, but we as volunteer managers, we are the conduit linking the skills and the organisational needs together. So I wouldn't worry so much about my own, you know, small amount of knowledge. Not everything will also always be appropriate, whatever has been offered, but making sure it's funneled in a useful way is the role of the volunteering professional usually.
Lovely. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Helen. Yeah, absolutely. And remembering that we do this daily in other avenues of our work, actually. So it's not something new for us. Lovely. So we started talking about some of the case studies that you've been involved in, and now it'd be nice to hear a little bit more about them. So we're going to go through each of our panelists. If you could tell us a little bit more about the one project that stands out for you and why, and what you and or your organisation learned from it, obviously within this environmental action, climate change, biodiversity field. We will do brief because there are four of you. So Ben, we'll come to you first.
Okay. I suppose the thing that I was thinking about was green space volunteering is something that we do. It's not so much a project, actually. It's something we do all the time. But we started to adapt that over the last few years, and to get our volunteers involved in things that are maybe like more heritage craft based. So hedge laying, willow, dry stone walling, things that can be done and enhance our green spaces, both for our visitors, but also enhance the biodiversity potential on site. And what we found really interesting with that for the volunteers, it was actually really low key. It wasn't a bad message, but as we did those activities, we talked about why we were going down that road, and sort of instead of putting fences in, we're putting hedges in, and sort of talking about those things with the volunteers. So what we found as a result was the volunteers then went away and inevitably volunteers are involved in 101 other volunteer organisations, aren't they? So they were taking some of that learning and they were talking about it in other spaces, and kind of that word of mouth got around that we were a place that was trying to use these techniques. So yeah, that would be mine, that by just those low-key changes in our volunteer programme that both benefited us, they then talked about us much more widely, and it helped us continue that work because they were on board with wanting to do it.
Thank you, Ben, and that's a great example for those organisations that perhaps haven't embarked on this area yet. Kirsty, what would be yours?
So I thought I'd mention one of our micro volunteering opportunities, which we call a Monument Monitor programme. And this is it was a project that developed from PhD research back in, I think, about 2018. And at various sites across the country, at various sites that we look after across the country, we essentially have a sign, and will say, if you take a photo of this aspect of the historic site and send it to a centralised mailbox, submit this image. And we've used the images that are collated and sent in to us to see how the changing climate is affecting, for example, some of our standing stone structures. But we can also use them to, monitor the impact of littering and plant growth and increase visitor footfall. And I suppose I wanted to highlight this because as a micro volunteering opportunity, so all it is a very small commitment from an individual. They're visiting an area or site anyway. They take a photo, they're sending it in, and it's a very small scale activity. But when we collate that information, we sort of collectively, we can hold it collectively, and it can help to make a real difference and support all our activity across Scotland. So yeah, small activities make a big difference.
Brilliant. I'm seeing a theme here, and yes, Sedasal runs very similar initiatives to you. Helen, what would be yours?
Well, I mean, my daily work is, as Ben describes, really using heritage techniques out in the gardens. So we're always coppicing, we're looking at using Austrian scythes to cut grass, we graze the meadows because that's, much less intrusive on the wildlife in those habitats. But I think I haven't been at the museum that long. I've been there a couple of years, and maybe the best project that I've done has been called Understanding Ourselves Through the Lens of Plants. It was a partnership project out in the community, and basically I did loads of outreach, and what I liked about it is we engage people that wouldn't normally engage with the museum. Most people, I think, don't know that the museum have got gardens. They don't really know a lot of our work. They tend to think of it somewhere where you take the kids to see dinosaurs. And we just had like a really diverse group telling us what plants are important to them, propagating them, caring for them, being filmed, drawing them. And it was just such a great project. And the good thing about it is that resulted in lots of those participants in that course then coming to volunteer with us. And because, they're really a diverse group, just diversified our volunteer cohort in the gardens dramatically as a result of that one project.
That's great, and keeping them within the family as well. I think that's a lovely outcome.
And just to say, I just quickly say as well, because it was a diverse group, we had people from other countries where climate change is really hitting people very hard. So one of our volunteers is from Bangladesh, and her friends and family are deeply affected by floods as a result of climate change. So just getting, that other perspective in from around the world is just so useful, and it really brings home the issues.
I think great point. Thank you, Helen. Marie, what would be yours?
One thing that we trialled this year was our Plants for Pollinators project. So we have there's plants that are listed as being great for pollinators, but external factors such as climate change have started to impact that list. So last year, the science team came to our team with a project aimed to collect data on pollinating plant lists from across the gardens. So the way in which we launched this was training existing volunteers in our gardens across lots of different roles. Didn't have to be a gardening role, could have been in retail, visitor services, whatever, to understand and help collect data to feed into this list. It means that they can do it on an existing volunteering day, which means they don't have to make any extra journeys. Also gives our current population of volunteers another opportunity to learn and feed into our strategic science work, thus fueling the ongoing and much needed advocacy in the wider community. It's also been remotely managed by the science team at our garden in Surrey, meaning that volunteers are also managing to collect data from across the garden, so up in the northeast, the northwest and Essex, and we're rolling it out in Devon in spring, which means we're capturing a range of weather conditions and weather factors, which will only also strengthen that list. So it's been a really good learning curve, a really good project for existing volunteers to get involved with, and just has been yeah, I think really successful in helping those strategic aims in our climate change and sustainability strategy.
Amazing. Thank you all. 4 quite different but aligned projects there. I'm going to be cheeky and ask a couple more questions, as we started a couple of minutes late, just so we can get as much goodness out of you as possible. And it's actually picking up on a point that Helen was talking about around sort of diversity and different voices within this subject. Increasing diversity within volunteer teams is a sort of a large part of what volunteer managers spend time thinking about and considering. We had a question from one of our audience members asking whether you've noticed any trends in the demographics of volunteers who actively get involved in this kind of work. And can you tell us about any projects that you've been involved in which may have actively targeted those that otherwise wouldn't be involved? And I don't know whether, Helen, you might kick us off on that one.
Well, yeah, most of our volunteers are women, and so actually we realise there's a bit of a gender divide there, and we're thinking actually in future cohorts we'll probably do some more targeted volunteering, perhaps at things like men's sheds and men's projects out in the community, so that we can address that a bit more.
Ben, any observations from the work you've done at Barnsley?
Quite varied, to be honest. I think whether because we've approached this as part of our general volunteer program as opposed to a targeted piece of work, that's kind of brought in a mixed crowd. But we also work very specifically with like our local college, who do courses like horticulture, for example, that tie very nicely to this area of work. So we have drawn in young people like that. I think it's interesting when you look more broadly at the movement around climate change and the different organisations. It does seem to have a broad base of what would be described as younger people. So there is something in there that I think we need to think about how we, if we engage in this topic, how do we target that to those people that are interested in and switched onto it, and therefore we need to make sure we're not doing it in a tokenistic way, because they will of course know that and respond to it. So yeah, quite a mixed approach from us, but as I say, I definitely think young people's voices are very strong in this particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it, they are the future of the planet. So actually, we need to be working very closely with them. Any thoughts, Kirsty Marie, on working with different audiences in this area of work? We can move on. Kirsty.
So I suppose it's worth, so we, Historic Environment Scotland is part of a national campaign called Nick Your Mark, which its primary aim is to increase the number and diversity of heritage volunteers in Scotland. And as part of that, one of the sort of projects that we've been sort of supporting as a campaign is partnering or different organisations up, so groups that might not necessarily traditionally consider volunteering with a particular organisation have a chance to co-curate a session and sort of a volunteering opportunity. So for example, I know that one of the groups that have been paired together is the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Group, who were paired with the Muslim Women's Trust, and they've had an opportunity to kind of co-create a session which, you know, and perhaps two organisations that may not naturally have found each other, shall we say, and I know that they're going on to do some additional kind of there's an additional session planned to follow up. So I think, yeah, as partnerships, co-creation, reaching out to audiences and to particular organisations can be a really interesting way to explore this topic.
Amazing, lovely. Well, we are over, so I'm going to squeeze in one very final question from our panelists, and that is to say, if you're thinking about our audience today, if you could give them one piece of advice for anyone attending today looking to engage volunteers in this area of work for the first time, or even their organisation, if you want to make it about your organisation, what advice would that be? And we'll go to Marie first.
Thank you. So for me, I would say it's important to bring volunteers along on the journey of change. You know, many of our volunteers have volunteered for long periods of time. We have some that have volunteered with us longer than some of our paid horticulturalists have been alive. So the way in which we garden and the practices that we are using are changing to become more sustainable, and that will be very different from when people started gardening many years ago. So making sure they understand the part that they play in the work that we do is so important, and in places it can be very influential even externally, so offering as much information as possible to them is pivotal.
Lovely, thank you. Kirsty.
I'm going to touch on what I've given my last, but I think partnerships, engaging sessions like this, sessions where we can sort of learn from each other, hear what other organisations are up to. So, you know, in terms of what I mentioned the last, so the Make Your Mark campaign group, that's a chance for heritage. There are over 100 of us involved in the campaign group across Scotland, heritage organisations. It's a chance for us to share best practice. We've just done a really interesting session on rural volunteering and touching on kind of transport and travel and how that, you know, that the kind of discussion. So I think, yeah, stealing from others organisations where we know there's great work going on. So I think partnerships and conversations are a really important part of this discussion. So reaching out to others.
Absolutely, and the rural session particularly I found very useful. So definitely a plug for Make Your Mark there. Helen.
Yeah, just agree with Kirsty, really. Going out to people rather than expecting them to come to you because you don't want to preach to the converted. And finding out where they're at and building on that, really, so that you're listening to their needs, I would say.
Lovely, thank you. Last but not least, Ben.
Yeah, I'm really drawn actually to something, a comment that's been made about a windmill and wind, and I think that is a really interesting piece of advice, to take the time to also look at what your assets are as a heritage organisation, and can they help you inform how you look forward. So I'm currently sat at a watermill that is powered by water, a sustainable source of energy. So how do we also celebrate and think about those stories that we put out as a way to bring people in? And sorry, just goes, our volunteers come to us because they love who we are. So taking that opportunity to celebrate maybe how our heritage assets can take us forward will hopefully also engage your volunteers as well, because they want to be part of your story.
And what a great way to bring it back to how we can use our USP within the heritage sector to drive this forward. Thank you, Ben. Thank you all so much for such a lively discussion. We could have gone on forever, and I did push it right to the wire. Please feel free, Ben, Kirsty, Marie, Helen, to pop any links in the chat for anything that you have spoken about today, if you want to spread the word. But otherwise, I'm going to hand over back to Matt to close the day.
Thank you, Rhiannon, and massive thank you to all of our panellists there. It was such a fascinating conversation. If you haven't noticed or been following the chat, there's loads of additional comments and resources in there as well, so it's well worth just taking a look at some of those and grabbing some of the links for you to take away today. So that brings us to the end of day one of Heritage Volunteering 24. We hope you've had a fantastic time and enjoyed it as much as we have. I want to say an absolutely massive thanks to all of the speakers, workshop hosts, everybody that's been with us today and helped make it possible. I think as we reflect on some of the workshops we've had, some of the things that we heard from Magdalene and in the panel discussion today, I think the one thing that does spring to mind is that change is possible. You know, everything that we talk about as heritage volunteering, everything that we talk about in terms of transformative volunteering can be achieved. And what we've seen today through those sessions is that all that it takes is some creative thinking, new ways of working, and us us to make that change, a reality. But of course, the journey around transformative volunteering doesn't end today. It starts again tomorrow. So we're going to be back here at 9:40 when we've got another day of workshops planned for you. We've got a great plenary with Martin J. Cowling, and we're also going to be presenting our Volunteer Leader of the Year award. So hopefully you'll all be back with us tomorrow for that. Thanks again for coming along today, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you. Bye bye.